Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free movie review of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. I went into this movie wanting to feel like a kid again. As we've been talking about all episode long, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are very near and dear to my heart, much like a lot of other 30, 35, 40-year-olds right now. And the great thing about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is about every decade we get a new introduction. So since their debut in the 80s and the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and now 2020s, depending on your age, you have a different opinion on what the best Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle series is of all time. I am a product of the 90s, so really to me, it's those 90s movies that really captured the essence of what made the Turtles great. And the reason I was excited about that going into this movie is because it's produced by Seth Rogen, who, much like me, is also a fan of that iteration of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I was excited about that because I knew with him as a producer on this movie, he was going to want to capture that same energy that made those movies great and bring that into this whole new story. And what I was pleasantly surprised by in this movie is that sometimes when a movie comes out like this, it just feels like a cash grab to me. You're banking on the fact that all the people that grew up with this franchise in the 80s and 90s are now adults with adult money and are going to go spend money to watch this movie to relive their childhood. But now those adults also have kids of their own. So what better moment of having this family bonding experience of you taking your now kids to go see something that you were a fan of when you were a kid. So I feel like sometimes movie studios and franchises like this just bank on that. And what they end up coming out with really is a cash grab. There's nothing added in. They just rehash old storylines and make it a movie that is just essentially what we knew as kids and don't really give us anything new. And I am happy to say that that is not the case with Mutant Mayhem. Quite the opposite, that this is a Ninja Turtle story that I haven't seen told in the comic books, in the TV shows, or in the movies. It's a whole new, more emotional look on the lives of the Ninja Turtles and what they face. So in this movie, you have all of our iconic characters back. You have Splinter, voiced by Jackie Chan, and then you have all of the Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and Donatello, all voiced by actual teenagers, which I think adds a great level of authenticity to their performances. And I heard Seth Rogen talking about how he wanted to capture that energy in this movie, and I think was greatly reflected out of all of their performances, is he has been a part of animated movies where you recorded everything completely different and you didn't see your co-stars until you went to that movie's premiere. He said the entire thing felt a little bit disconnected because you're not getting to interact with those people until the very end, so you don't really get this type of performance that really has a lot of emotion into it. It wasn't until he worked on a movie later in his career where he actually sat down with the other actors that he felt like, oh, you can actually connect with other people. So he took that idea and applied it to this movie and had all of the kids in a room together to interact. And what you get and what you hear in the movie is very authentic performances of just teenagers hanging out, being teenagers. And I've never really seen that fully encaptured in a movie, whether it be live action or whether it be animated, of just capturing that young innocence energy. And it's very much a snapshot into what teens are like right now with the use of words like bussin' or riz. All of those things are used and really effortlessly in their performances. So you don't have like adult actors trying to sound like teenagers. You have actual kids delivering these lines, which adds just another layer of authenticity. So you have the teenage part down. You get to the mutant part, which doesn't really stray away from the origin story we know about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They come into contact with ooze. In this case, it is the product of a scientist who is trying to create all these animals to create this mutant animal family. You have a fly who later becomes the villain in the movie as Superfly. You also have the classic OG villains, Bebop and Rocksteady, and then all of these other new characters that are a lot of fun. But his place gets raided. The ooze goes down into the sewer, and there you find our four characters who come into contact with the ooze, and that is where Splinter finds them and tries to rescue them, in turn turning into a mutant himself. One of my favorite sequences in this movie is all the Ninja Turtles as kids, and they are so adorably cute that I would want to see a spin-off of this movie of just their adventures as kids. So maybe down the line they want to do Baby Mutant Ninja Turtles. I think that would be a home run hit because they are so adorable to look at and so funny. But I feel like what really brings this entire story together is the animation style. So we have the teenage, we have the mutant. The Ninja Turtle part comes out in its animation style, which I think now owes a lot of credit to Spider-Man Into and Across the Spider-Verse, of showing that animated movies can be a lot more sophisticated, not only in the style of the animation, but also in the storytelling, which you see a lot in this movie. So, in a way, I feel like that movie paved the way for this movie to be made. Essentially, it was the blueprint of this movie because we did get a TMNT animated theatrical release in 2007, which was a lot more kid friendly. It was still fun, but in no way does it compare to what they did in this movie. And it's a very unique animation style. I don't really think it ripped off the Spider-Verse animation style, which to me, that just feels like a comic book come to life. What they did in this movie, it almost feels like a kid's book that you would read maybe in like third or fourth grade, that had this very like unique, colorful, almost watercolor based illustrations. It was almost like that come to life. Had this very fun and warm, inviting tone that I think this movie will greatly speak to kids, but also me as an adult and a fan of animation now. Just gives me something very unique to look at. All of the character designs were very nicely updated, kind of along the same lines of the look we got in the late 2000s and early 2010s of the Ninja Turtles. So I would say if they were trying to recreate any era of the Ninja Turtles, it would be that era, not so much the original 80s cartoon. So you have the animation style, and then you have the soundtrack and the score in this movie, which a lot of the soundtrack is 90s hip hop, which is perfectly used in this movie. To hear Wu-Tang in an animated movie like this also just really warmed my heart. And I find it surprising how well this entire soundtrack worked in this movie. Maybe it's because Ice Cube is the voice of Superfly. You also have my favorite artist, Post Malone, as Ray Fillet. Ray Fillet! So maybe the 90s hip hop aspect was just an easy plug and play. But aside from the 90s hip hop, you also have this menacing score, synth pop rock that is very charging throughout the entire movie. Now that did remind me a lot of Into the Spider-Verse, of having this kind of dark, unsettling tone that something bad was going to happen. So this entire score just really helped drive home the tone in this movie, which I feel like is one of the most emotional stories told in a Ninja Turtles movie. Really, the main message of this movie is them wanting to feel like humans do and be accepted by humans, when you have their dad Splinter telling them how awful humans are, and they are trying to prove him wrong by going out and experiencing the real world for the first time after a lifetime of living down in the sewer. So this is really their true origin story of becoming heroes, and one of my favorite scenes is the first time they get into a real fight, which brings one of my favorite things of superheroes discovering their powers. It's them finally getting to use all of their iconic weapons against this new enemy for the very first time. So it is a very mature and more developed Ninja Turtle story, proving it doesn't just have to be that cheesy 80s cartoon or the silliness of the 90s or the more playfulness and family-friendly iterations that we've had in the 2000s and 2010s. Now showing that these characters have a little bit more depth, can be taken a little bit more seriously, at least to the adults who see this movie, but also being warm, fun, and inviting to all the kids. Because surprisingly, this movie does have, I don't want to say bad language, but a little bit more suggestive than I was expecting. There are times that I feel like Ice Cube had to kind of pull the reins in a little bit, where he easily could have dropped some S, maybe even some F-bombs in this movie. He probably did while recording his lines, and they're like, hey, you got to tone it back. This is a Nickelodeon film. But as far as the violence, it is far less violent than the original TMNT movie. So I feel like this movie was very much a love letter and an ode to all those classic OG fans of the franchise, even from the opening scene where all of the Ninja Turtles are on this roof in New York City, where it's essentially the cover of that first ever Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic book. That was kind of like, hey, we see all you original fans, and then quickly just opens up to, here is what we're actually going to do and introduce these turtles to a whole new generation. And I think they completely nailed it. I can't wait to see what they do next. I can't wait to see what all other villains they incorporate in this franchise, which again, I won't spoil anything, but they have a whole new take on the way the Ninja Turtles interact with the villains, which was really what made this movie for me. So for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Mutant Mayhem, I give it 4 out of 5 heroes in a half shell. Turtle power!